Chapter 4. Array Class Monitoring System, Coverage Zone 4, Group 3. Surviving members full. Convicted 578043 through 578060. Class 12 Prison World, Attica. Sentence death. 20 rotation commitment. Rotation 2. He had always known Oxot to be a somewhat particular species. With meticulous attention to detail, their minds fixated on the smaller things in the realms of planning, texture, and physical traits. It was of these things that had provided their foundation, that had been the basis of the lineage which led to their evolution. The power of observation and the application of results even when they seemed irrelevant. The military had long taken notice of this, utilizing their talents by keeping small groups of them in command structures even when not directly needed. When Oxot grew nervous, it was wise to take note and the time for one to consider what had been missed. "I don't like this place." The field leader spoke with a quiet, rasping voice which shot through Rukali's mind as it streamed along the translation neural networks. "The soil doesn't sound right." A murmur of agreement met the statement as the other soldiers kneaded their claws into the soil impatiently. Besides the soldiers, there were only a few others who had been willing to travel into the ancient city. Most of them had remained by the craft, standing by on the perimeter and waiting on the transmitter. 3 engineers had joined up with the impromptu military unit, making a squad of 7, including himself. It wasn't a huge force, but from what could be determined, they weren't tracking something that would require more manpower. "I'm not certain what species is with the siren, but it isn't particularly large." One of the soldiers hissed the information out, just enough to be audible to the group. It was the smaller of the two following the field leader, recognizable with a patch of red scales on its tail that never seemed to perfectly blend with the rest of its camouflage. "It's likely that ship beast of hers. I remember it during the meeting planet-side before the fighting." "Anything to worry about?" Rukali asked as he crouched down to view the prints. The footprints were barely visible, even as he brought down the suit HUD screen to analyze. There wasn't much it could tell, although the impressions seemed to indicate that the creature was extremely dense in mass and weight. The Oxot didn't reply immediately as it rose to peer into the shadows beginning to form along the alleyways. "It survived that mess in better shape than any of us did." Rukali thought on that statement for a long time as they continued their search through the city. All the while, he tried his best to ignore the itching feeling of hair rising under his suit. The first commander did not stress his title. In fact, outside of the faint acknowledgement that he had one at all, Rukali remained silent on the subject entirely, content to simply watch over them with his massive height. It bothered Hiko, and at the same time seemed to strengthen the respect that she and all of the surviving engineers already felt for him. He was a leader, and it projected from his stature in an aura like the heat from a sun. Strength, wisdom, and dedication. The soldiers of their group might lead them, but Rukali was the one that steered. Subtle suggestions, half-guised hints, compliments. If the field leader was aware of it, the massive Oxot didn't seem to mind. Hiko was beginning to think that the veteran didn't know what to do in such a situation and was grasping at any potential option that presented itself. The soldiers had a hard edge to them, impersonal and distant. Both of those traits were traditional and expected of their species, but it was more than just that. The Oxot were a different breed from the Union troopers Hiko was experienced with. Unlike a majority of the Union military which held the line, these were ground combat and infantry soldiers. These were the type they called in for the messy work when there was no drone, array, or fleet to rely on from a distance. These were the ones who got their claws dirty in the muck on the ground, the teeth that ground the grit. Those were rare along the lines, even in the 33rd, which had been overstepping the Mercy Protocol for cycles. Ground and boarding combat were simply less common divisions in a fleet when the enemy could only be fought and defeated from a distance. Still, the difference was palpable. Their native camouflage slicked through their combat suits, which had been set to translucent, causing them to blend into the surrounding scenery in such a way that Hiko would have overlooked them had they not been directly in front of her. Caution, not pride, nor confidence. That was the difference. These were souls that had seen the worst, survived, and would prefer to avoid having a repeat of previous events. She could see why the commander had fallen in behind them with confidence. They were better off that way. As she followed them, dropping down to the plaza below, she marveled at the strange beauty that still permeated the ancient architecture. This had been something spectacular thousands of cycles before, but exactly how far back its history went was a mystery. Some still had the faint markings of symbols carved along their edges or held within the tainted glass. Old means of passage indication, before the Union focused on the holographic projectors for a majority of indicators. A long straightaway was where they finally caught the pair, sprinting down the alien sands towards the fleeting sunlight. The ship beast was leading the path, and the shipmaster was following, tiny puffs of dust kicking up with each of their hurried steps. Easily 200 units away, the Oxots didn't hesitate. When they had the siren in their sights, the soldiers had opened fire with a rapid barrage. Even with the atmospheric composition and the increased gravity, their shots were accurate, hitting the fleeing individual with staggering blows, which popped her personal shielding unit in an instant and threw her to the dirt. It was quick, effective, and non-lethal, relying on the shock of impact to incapacitate the siren shipmaster before she commanded her guardian to defend. As they approached, though, the beast was unaffected, and had doubled back to block their path. Though it had a long blade slung over its back, it didn't bother to use it, or even acknowledge it, as it drew a line in the sand with its foot and raised its upper limbs. The message was clear. None could pass. Hiko was perplexed by this behavior. Perhaps it was some panicked order issued at the last second, a practiced fail-safe command. Siren weren't very common in military duty, but she had heard rumors of their bonded beasts and the tremendous control they could exert. Still, it was uncanny. The resemblance. Her contemplation was interrupted by a shower of blood covering her shell. The gurgling scream of a dying soul rattled through the air, a beg for help. Rukali's spear flashed out and through with a roar of anger as shots began to blast back past her from the soldiers, one of which glanced her head carapace and sent her reeling to the ground with nausea. As the shouts and yells and gunfire erupted around her, Hiko's mind swam and rounded. It was all she could do to stare at the ship beast farther off in the distance as it picked up the siren. In the confusion, it made a break for it. As they turned the corner in the distance, she heard the voices of panic. One was unmistakably siren, and the other was untranslatable for the most part. Patches of it were in the siren language, ringing out in solid tones, but infrequently there were patches of another language, shouted in short syllables. They echoed through her brain, rattling around with the pain of the concussion she had more than likely just received. Slowly she felt herself being dragged out of the alley, into the sunlight, and away from the black vines of death that still feasted on their 7th member. Now there were 6.
"What's wrong with you, Yatel? Run! You need to run!"
The voice shouted from far off as another figure crashed through a street in the distance. Further shots could be heard before a sickening scream brought them to a sudden still. The sensation of grim satisfaction touched her, a far-off echo of heightened emotion. Run. Keep on running. They were close, and they were armed. Yatel ducked under a shattering window, overrun with desert sand as she rolled past the long shadow, weaving through the slow growth that had begun to sprout from its strange soil. Her breath was filling her lungs and exiting so quickly she felt her cells would burst. She needed to get into the sunlight, but there was too little. Speckled shadows of frames and glass were blocking it at every turn. In the distance, the soft sounds of death crackled and groaned, seething forward to reach out their fibers like millions of tiny claws. Movement was key, to keep in motion. That was the only thing besides half-glimmers of the sun's influence keeping her alive. They should have known someone would respond on the surface. The escape pods launching had been anything but subtle. Still, Yatel would have hoped for more time before they were found. They had barely lasted 2 rotations. Behind her there was a group of Union soldiers. In front of her was a thinning list of options. If only it was just the soldiers. More motion to her left. There was no light there. Another dive and roll. Her tail curled up past her shoulder as she let the inertia carry her to the next patch of fading safety, drawing her gun as she did so to blast aimlessly forward for the threats trying to block her route. It was greeted by the hissing of steam, the crackling of tissue, and another sound as well. Yatel could almost find herself believing it was a scream of anger. In the light, she was in a temporary limbo. Safe, but only for so long. She desperately needed it. Siren were capable athletes when compared to many species, but their limits were simply that, limits. Mentally fortifying herself would not help her if she pushed past them, and she was hugging that line. Ragged low notes of pain sang out. Her breath was catching in her chest as she felt her lungs compress in agony. This city was a maze, a labyrinth, perfectly designed for torture, for fear, for a horrific game of survival. A yell of agony cut off with such abruptness Yatel could almost bring the image to her mind. Another soldier had met their end, torn apart by the massive grip of a black vine. It had been very close. "Human?" Yatel shouted as she sent her mind outward, probing for the connection. That cry had been nearby, but it hadn't been him. She would have known. He was still alive unless he had been diverted. Unless he was thousands of units from her, lost in the same panic she had been. A soft crushing of sand brought her mind back to alert as she threw her sidearm towards the disturbance and fired, the light rounds ringing out in rapid symphony. Another sprint to the next patch. This one was almost gone. She had to find her way to a street perpendicular to the sunlight, a stretch of true clearance. She blasted the ground before her as she ran, counting the shots. It was an old habit that had been beaten into her over years, endless rotations of military training. Count the shots, know when you have to reload, or double back for another to take your place. It was a pointless exercise in this circumstance. There wasn't a single round left on her besides those in the weapon already. She screamed a note of terror as she was pulled off of her feet and dragged at a rapid pace away from her original route. Her hands grasped desperately at the firm hold around her waist, lashing out with her tail. "Calm, Yatel. You need to stay calm." The sensation of security hit her, an abrupt, hard stop. That was an arm, not a vine. She was in the sunlight. "It's me, Yatel. We're safe. Only a few more blocks to go."
"We're not safe. I know that, and you know that. We are not safe."
Her breathing leveled as she rose back to her feet, smacking the ground with her tail in frustration.
"First those soldiers, now this thing. I'm not even certain what it is. Some biological experiment? An ancient security system? Human, I can see into your mind, and you know as well as I do that we are not safe."
His body language almost appeared relaxed as he readied his sword for another run. 2 more stretches of shadowed ground lay before them and the empty desert. It was in plain sight along the straightaway, a length of ancient road. "We are never completely safe." He let out a heavy exhalation as he slowed his heartbeats in some strange instinctive manner, some primal intuition for pushing limits on his body. "We're no marathon runners, but I'm betting we can make it."
"What is a Never mind. It doesn't matter. We are not making that, human. That's at least 80 units of distance, and those vines know we are here. They'll cut off our route, and we'll be dragged down."
"A marathon is a 26-mile run." The man threw the sword into its sheath as he turned back to Yatel. "But we're lucky. This is a sprint." She felt his intention as soon as he turned to her, but she wasn't quick enough to get away. He was insane. She was in the clutches of a being gripped with insanity. His mind was a flood of images, calculations he didn't even appear to be aware of occurring, estimations of tactics while mid-flight. She called it flight, but they were all too close to the ground. Even with its insane physical strength, the human abided by the force of gravity. By the time she had thought to flee, Yatal found herself thrown over a thick shoulder, traveling faster than any being should without a vehicle. Any other survivors still alive heard the scream of rage and horror that echoed through the ancient streets and desert sand.
"You son of a frickin' fucking shit!"